Ludmilla stared down at the spider lily clasp as she and her company formed back up in the empty city plaza. It seems we were sidetracked before you could share your thoughts on the fight with the sword wraith, Miss Zaradnik. She looked up from the clasp to where the Sorcerer King was descending the steps of the barracks entrance with Lady Shiltier. The three of them had conducted a thorough search of the barracks, but, in the end, the piece of jewelry was the only thing that they came away with. "Yes, Your Majesty," Ludmilla replied. "Was there something in particular that you would like to know?" "Considering what happened," His Majesty said, "the nature of that sword wraith is of interest to me. It is not often that undead can elude domination like that." Ludmilla frowned as she recalled the strange behavior of the sword wraith. "It was like fighting an intelligent opponent," she said, "yet it seemed mindless at the same time. She used something like a highly advanced form of the style that rapier users in the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild have just started to develop. Everything from her attacks to her movements was like fighting a live opponent." "I see. In what way was she mindless, then?" "It was either mindlessness or single-mindedness," Ludmilla replied. "I timed her lunge skill with the first two users and was reliably able to exploit that timing to bait her into the attack that severed her right arm. I also had no way to conceal my presence from her, so she should have known I was undead. Even so, all of her strikes were aimed at human vitals. It was like fighting an undead from a bard's tale. She was filled with rage against my existence and seemed entirely committed to my demise." "That much I've noticed," the Sorcerer King seemed to smirk. "The only thing that comes to mind at the moment is that the item was a magical trap left to defend the building even after the city was destroyed. It's a shame that it appears inert now. My arcane vision cannot detect even the slightest trace of mana coming off of it." She gave the intricate piece of jewelry one last look before putting it away. Beside the Sorcerer King, Lady Shiltier raised a hand to her ear. "Lord Ines," she said. "Cocytus has prepared the first batch of troops." "Excellent," the Sorcerer King said. "Have him send them over right away. Since we're out on the field, have someone, Gem, one of the fellows from the library should be fine." "By your command, Lord Ines," Lady Shiltier lowered her head. "Also, Cocytus wants to come too." A deep chuckle rose into the air. "With what this excursion has turned into," the Sorcerer King said, "I suppose I should have expected that. Cocytus has really taken a shine to his role as Grand Marshal." With the gradual organization of the Royal Army into a formal state institution, official military ranks started to manifest as well. At the top of the nation's military stood Lord Cocytus with the rank of Grand Marshal. Ludmilla wasn't sure if it was an exact translation, as Lady Shiltier's mouth moved to form distinctly different words in her own language, but since the term came across smoothly, it was probably close enough. The orderly nature of the Sorceress Kingdom meant that ranks and titles matched the responsibilities of those who held them, just as Clara and Leanne had been promoted from Baroness to Countess to reflect their expanded administrative authority. The rank of Grand Marshal represented the highest authority in any regional military under their nation's executive branch. It would not be proper to address Lord Cocytus as King or Emperor, after all. His Majesty struck a thoughtful pose, cradling his chin in a pristine skeletal hand. "We're fine as we are," he said after several moments, "but have him come to the city. A second-floor guardian nearby will be helpful in the event that a true threat appears. In the meantime, he can oversee the refurbishment of this old garrison. It should serve well as a local base of operations for the Royal Army. Let's step up our game, shall we, Miss Zaradnik? We'll be taking a short break while I see to some things at home and Cocytus establishes his headquarters here. Once we resume our exploration, Cocytus will be the general while you act as one of the captains under his command." "Oh, he's going to go crazy when he hears that," Lady Shiltier said. "I imagine so," the Sorcerer King chuckled again. "If I may ask, Your Majesty," Ludmilla said, "is it all right for us to be doing this? It was meant to be your personal excursion." "Don't make it sound so lonely, Miss Zaradnik. Adventures are meant to be shared. While the course ours has taken was unexpected, it is just as I said about adventures back then, yes? They are not only the concern of small parties and may expand to become grand in scope and purpose. A minor campaign like this is not unwelcome. We are enjoying ourselves, learning new things, exploring the unknown and changing the world around us. The adventure that I hoped for has become one in truth." The dark portal of a gate spell widened in the plaza nearby. Lord Cocytus appeared out of the portal, moving out of the way of the contingent that followed. His insectoid head turned as he scanned the surroundings with his many eyes. Upon spotting the Sorcerer King, he strode forward with purposeful steps. He planted the base of his massive halberd on the ground and went to a knee. Lord Ines. As commanded, I have come. And so another adventurer joins our party. A smile seeped into His Majesty's tone. A adventurer? Umu. Did Shiltir let you know what your role will be here? Lord Cocytus rose to his feet. His gaze went to Lady Shiltir. I thought it would be a nice surprise, she answered his unspoken question. A surprise? Indeed, the Sorcerer King said. Our adventure has become a campaign of sorts. Starting from the border of the Sorceress Kingdom, we've conquered our way down the river to this city. The building you see here is the result of our latest victory. It will be the headquarters where you will serve as the general for our little campaign. Oh. Lord Cocytus' posture shifted, and a blast of frozen air pushed the mists around him away. Though he had uttered a single syllable, excitement filled his tone. Your first task, however, His Majesty said, will be to fix up your headquarters. We can still use it as a garrison building when we're done here. Garrison, then, the Katsa Plains, will be taken. For the time being, send forces to secure the areas that we have already traveled through. Prepare teams for reconnaissance, as well. It's high time we stop relying on these nearly useless local maps. In a few hours, we'll be resuming our advance, so have a basic map of the city available for us by then. Miss Saradnik here will be serving as one of your captains on the field. She has a special company under her command. Ludmilla's new general turned his head to inspect her contingent. Red skeleton warriors. These forces, not ours. They've been dominated out of the local undead. Not long after we entered the plains, she formed a company starting with low-level undead like skeleton archers and undead beasts. What you see before you is the result of her advance down the river, slowly replacing her old soldiers with vanquished ones. A challenge, interesting. And enviable. Ludmilla frowned at Lord Cocytus' choice of words. Enviable, my lord? Cocytus' first battle employed forces not dissimilar to what you started with, the Sorcerer King told her. The initial results were rather catastrophic, but he made gains for the Sorceress Kingdom in the end. I'm sure he would love to try his hand at it once more with all the experience he has gained. Another blast of frigid air washed over the surroundings. A new gate appeared, delivering contingents of Death Knights, Death Warriors and Death Cavaliers riding Soul Eaters to the plaza. Several wagons rolled through, filled with what appeared to be construction supplies and materials for the barracks. The Sorcerer King glanced over at the activity. I'll be taking that gate back to the Sorceress Kingdom, His Majesty said as he walked over. I suppose I should focus on creating death priests for the next few days. His voice cut off as he entered the portal, leaving Lady Shiltir, Lord Cocytus and Ludmilla amidst the bustling preparations. Ludmilla glanced over the growing piles of supplies. In all honesty, it was a minuscule amount for the effective strength gathered in the ruined plaza. A conventional human army had a 1-kilometer-long baggage train for every 1,000 soldiers. Demi-human armies could have much shorter baggage trains depending on if they could eat the people they fought and raided along the way. Rangers could operate without a baggage train, but there were limits to how much foraging and hunting an area could support. Undead armies, on the other hand, required no baggage train at all. What were they transporting, anyway? What was needed to restore the damaged barracks was plainly apparent, but the other articles, not so much. An elder lich holding a clipboard approached him, its imp familiar sitting on its shoulder. Lord Cocytus, it said. The construction materials will be stored outside, but what will we do with the rest? The basement of the barracks is in good condition, Ludmilla spoke into the silence between them. It will require a thorough dusting, however. The elder lich glanced at Lord Cocytus. The Grand Marshal nodded once and the elder lich went on its way, calling together a score of Death Knights to help unload the wagons. My apologies if I spoke out of turn, Lord Cocytus. It's fine, Lord Cocytus grunted. More importantly, our orders. Of course, Ludmilla nodded. Will you be setting up a war room as you did in the Dwarf Kingdom? Yes. Other rooms, also. Offices. Archives. Divination chambers. Ludmilla briefly reviewed the layout of the building. once repairs were complete. "This structure was formerly a garrison barracks," she said. "I'm not sure how quickly the third floor can be restored, but the areas formerly used as living space should provide more than enough room for everything you describe." "Good. War room, first. After, assist with the rest." "Yes, my lord, or would it be Grand Marshal here?" Lord Cocytus seemed to start sparkling at the latter, and Ludmilla's lips turned up in a slight smile. The Grand Marshal eyed her for a moment before turning away with a brusque grunt. Still smiling, Ludmilla went to see if Lady Sheltier needed anything before going to help with the new local headquarters. She found her liege idly filing her nails near the fountain. The focused expression that she wore while escorting the Sorcerer King had melted away. It must have been quite draining to maintain her vigilance as His Majesty's sole protector for days on end. "Is there anything I can do for you, my lady?" "There are many things that I desire of you," Lady Sheltier replied lightly, "but nothing that would be appropriate in this setting, though I did hear something about a collar and a secret meeting with Mayor in a public garden at night." "I probably don't want to know where this is going," Ludmilla frowned. "How are things on your front with His Majesty? I feel that I've been sabotaging your efforts since he's been so keen on observing my progress." Despite my wanting to grow closer to Lord Irons on a more personal level, Lady Sheltier told her, "It is still a joy to spend so much time by His Majesty's side. Your gaining his approval also works in my favor, just as you are my responsibility. Your achievements are also my own. If things continue as they are, well, we'll just have to see what happens when the time comes." Lady Sheltier turned her attention back to her nails, leaving Ludmilla with that mysterious note. Making her way from the fountain back to the barracks, Ludmilla watched as a pair of elder liches unfurled a banner of the Sorceress Kingdom. They flew up and fastened it over the entrance of the building. It was so huge that it hung all the way down to the top of the gate. She shook her head as she made her way inside. Where in the world had they gotten a 7-meter-long banner on such short notice? Furthermore, the banner was woven out of the same precious threads as those displayed in the Sorceress Kingdom. The existence of gold embroidery was known to Ludmilla, but having an entire banner fashioned out of precious ores was a ludicrous notion. The vermilion banners of the Sorceress Kingdom were beyond the silken flags displayed by great houses and nations in their highest halls. They fluttered in the wind, catching the light to glimmer with the fiery radiance of a field of perfect rubies. Of course, there was no light where they were. It was also in the middle of a wasteland littered with ruins. The part that made her shake her head marveled over the fact that such an incalculably expensive banner had been used. At the same time, however, she recognized the statement for what it was. This was no simple cloth flag that could be abandoned on a whim and trampled. It represented the will and investment of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Raising this banner was a bold declaration to the entire world that they were here to stay. Over the course of the next few hours, Ludmilla went around assisting the headquarters staff as renovations were made and furnishings added to the former barracks. She wasn't sure why it was necessary to come up with the aesthetically pleasing arrangements that they deliberated over for hours on end. One of the main advantages of undead armies was that they could do without the needs and comforts of the living, was it not? Luxurious pieces of furniture that one might find in the manors of Irantal's central district were placed in every room. Militant artwork, ornamental, at least they looked ornamental, weapons, armor, plush carpets and other incalculably valuable articles accented the halls and corridors. By the time everything was tentatively arranged, the army headquarters outstripped the shining golden pavilion by far. Strangely, the kitchen had been restored as a kitchen, as was the mess hall. There were beds in the quarters for officers. Did they plan on stationing the living here, as well? Despite changing the look of the place, they were still in the Katza Plains, and having a zombie manifest in one's bedroom while they were sleeping was almost certainly a bad thing. The halls were also magically lit, but Katza's mists remained, giving the entire building an eerie feeling. As Ludmilla pondered the strange choices, she came across Lady Sheltier on the way to the war room. She was out of her combat equipment and back into her black ballroom gown. Its skirts swept over the floor as her liege made her way down the corridor wearing a pleased expression. With the surroundings as they were, the image she presented seemed to match the atmosphere perfectly. Lady Sheltier. Out of curiosity, were you the one that had all these furnishings delivered? About 2/3 of them. That Cocytus wanted to mount equipment everywhere. Why? No reason. In hindsight, it should have been obvious. Lady Shiltier's taste in decor was quite distinct. Her liege tilted her head curiously, then seemed to shrug to herself. She wrapped an arm around Ludmilla's elbow, and together they continued to the war room. Unlike the one in the Dwarf Kingdom, the war room here was completely staffed by the undead, save for the Grand Marshal himself. Rather than rectangular, the table was circular. Over its polished obsidian surface lay a velvet cloth. Upon that cloth was a map with few features. Various markers, plotting rods and documents were arranged along its sides. Around the table stood 4 elder liches, 2 death knights and 2 death cavaliers. Lord Cocytus stood at the head of the table, and Lady Shiltier went to occupy the open space opposite to him. The Grand Marshal nodded in greeting. "Preparations complete?" Lady Shiltier glanced at her. "For the time being," Ludmilla replied. "I suspect that the staff will be rearranging everything once repairs to the building are complete. How go our efforts to map the area?" "Vexing. Few features. Once a city, now a layout." Studying the map, Ludmilla thought his description apt. There was little of note, so the teams surveying the ruins were left with little to do except detail the vast field of rubble that lay where the city once stood. As a ranger, she had a sense of what her surroundings looked like and could make passable maps, but what the surveyors had done so far truly put the scale of the ruins into perspective. Thousands of flattened buildings lay within a vast network of streets and alleys. Her estimates of the city's size had been right on the mark. Its population would have rivaled the capitals of both Baharuth and Riestais. Yet this capital-sized city was not the capital of the state that once existed here. The city designated on the local maps was to the south of them, and Ludmilla idly wondered what sights would greet them in what was surely a metropolis of unimaginable proportions. Her eyes were drawn to what appeared to be the only building left standing in the city aside from the new army headquarters. The large circle lay across the city center from where they were, roughly 2 kilometers distant. "Is this a tower?" "Yes." "Is this a symbolic marker?" "No." If that was the case, she wondered what sort of tower it was. From what was drawn on the map, the diameter of the structure's base was nearly the size of Vierantal's central district. The other 2 towers they had come across were about what one might have expected for the keeps of a decently sized castle. This one dwarfed them by far. "Were any details gathered beyond the building's existence?" Ludmilla asked. "No," Lord Cocytus answered. "Lord Dines. He wishes to explore himself." Despite his kingly demeanor, it was the first bit of kingly behavior that Ludmilla had seen out of the Sorcerer King. Reserving the best portions for himself or bestowing them upon a favored subject, Ludmilla waved away the thought before she floated away on the idea that he might be showing her special favor. It was His Majesty's excursion, so it was a matter of course that he would spend his time on the parts most interesting to him. "I see," she said. "In that case, I should report what I know about the locations on our journey so far before His Majesty returns." Considering that most of what they had crossed was a desolate wasteland, there was little to describe aside from the ruins around the 2 towers and the bank of the river that they followed. Most of their time was spent estimating the required frequency of patrols, the suitable number of sentries for the river routes and the survey work for the portion of the plains that they had already passed, but did not personally explore. There was also the matter of how close to the borders of neighboring nations they should send their patrols. Ludmilla advised that they remain within the perimeter of darkness created by the mists to minimize the risk of incidents with their neighbors. A long discussion about patrol composition was underway when Lady Shiltier, mid-yawn, raised a hand to her ear. Her black ballroom gown was replaced by her crimson plate armor, and she turned to walk over to a clear area nearby. Everyone turned to lower their heads as the Sorcerer King made his entrance. "Welcome back, Lord Dines," Lady Shiltier said. "Umu. I have returned." They raised their heads in unison at his reply. Behind His Majesty, a dozen death priests made their way out of the gate. Ludmilla eyed the group as they marched out of the war room. The Sorcerer King had mentioned something about creating death priests for the next few days. Did that mean he could create a dozen Death Series servitors a day? Or were these only the few that he brought with him, the rest being dispatched to other parts of the royal army? Not that a dozen wasn't plenty. It was enough to devastate both Riestais and the Empire, at least. Ludmilla went to join Lady Shiltier to make room for His Majesty at the table. He rested his hands on its surface, leaning forward to examine the map. "Only one other location of note in the city, Excellent work, this has saved us days of scouring these ruins on our own. Ha! The Grand Marshal saluted, and the undead at the table followed suit. The Sorcerer King turned and came to where Lady Shaltira waited. Let's continue on our adventure, shall we? Yes, Lord Ines. They followed the Sorcerer King back out of the barracks. As he went around to take a look at the activity around the plaza, Ludmilla jogged over to join her contingent. More undead had arrived since she had entered the barracks, as well as more supplies. Scaffolding was being raised around the building's exterior with various materials neatly organized around it. The first of the undead patrols, consisting of 2 elder liches, a death priest, 6 death knights and 4 death warriors, set out, all mounted on soletas. As they passed by, Ludmilla thought the looks they cast upon her and her company were a mix of respect and envy. A short while later, the Sorcerer King and Lady Shaltira returned from their brief inspection. They truly covet duties to carry out in your Majesty's service, Ludmilla said. Yes, I suppose so, Miss Saradnik. They are essentially summons, so it is natural for them to seek the commands of their summoner. Since they are intelligent, however, I often wish they would be less arbitrary when matters aren't so pressing. Do you find that strange? To wish for one's own creations to express free will? If they were regular summons, it would be. Casters called them for a specific purpose and they were dismissed when that purpose was fulfilled or the duration of the spell that summoned them expired. The Sorcerer King's undead creations, however, were permanent. In addition, the Elder Liches, Death Series Servitors and Soul Eaters possessed roughly human-level intelligence. Though each type was shaped by the same mold, so to speak, time and experience led to a slow divergence and the development of distinct personalities. If one considered that they would exist in perpetuity unless somehow destroyed, it did feel sad that they were ultimately bound by their existence as summons. A part of her thought that she might simply be projecting a one-sided empathy towards them. They owed their creation to the Sorcerer King, after all, but it appeared that His Majesty felt the same way. I find that their behavior is somewhat similar to how loyal vassals conduct themselves in the presence of their liege, Ludmilla said. Away from your immediate presence, each does express themselves more freely. They remain your servitors and thus their existence still revolves around your service, but they have a will that exists within those bounds. In Warden's Vale, my subjects can tell the locally stationed Death Knights apart by their personalities alone. Is that so? Your territory sounds like an interesting place, Miss Saradnik. I should come by and take a look around one day. Ludmilla froze, imagining His Majesty's priceless robes sweeping over the rough, unswept stone of her mostly undeveloped capital. We've barely started construction, Your Majesty, she said. I'm afraid there isn't too much to see at the moment. Another undead contingent made their way by as they went on patrol. They straightened under the gaze of the Sorcerer King, and even the Soul Eaters seemed to take on a proud gait until they disappeared into the mists. Ludmilla marveled over how quickly the place had taken on the atmosphere of a military installation. I doubt that anyone will notice until the official announcement, she said, but what will the neighboring nations say about this occupation? Do you think they'll say anything at all, Miss Saradnik? His Majesty asked. It's not as if this region holds any practical value to them. The economic value of the region to the living is non-existent, Ludmilla answered. No, it's actually a drain on resources since it must be continually suppressed with no tangible gains. It has a certain strategic value, however. The Empire would probably be relieved that their suzerain had moved to alleviate the threat along their southwestern border. With the Azalizia Mountains, Irantal and the Katsa Plains under the Sorceress Kingdom's influence, 3 legions worth of national defense, plus the budget for adventurers and workers, could be allocated elsewhere. While it was true that 2 legions had been dissolved, the spare legion that remained would be free to carry out imperial policy. National defense was a careful balancing act, and the grand interplay between states where each had their own to perform determined the broad balance of power in a region. An entire legion being freed of garrison duties meant that they could be employed to tip that balance and change the geopolitical landscape. I see. The Sorcerer King's voice drew her from her thoughts. So you believe that our occupation may be perceived as a potential threat? Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. Security is a sovereign state's responsibility, one that others cannot be relied upon. Threats to national security tend to be first considered out of practical concerns. The Sorceress Kingdom's occupation of the Katsa Plains would be a dire one from their perspective. Since our army is primarily undead, the Katsa Plains is essentially an unassailable corridor that may be used to strike at every other nation in the region. Well, it already is, but drawing attention to the fact is sure to result in additional worries. So you would advise that we not make an official announcement at all? From a strategic perspective, there's no reason to let anyone know unless we want them to for some reason. From a diplomatic perspective, I'm not qualified to offer any real advice. Personally, I would say yes simply to be forthright with our neighbors, but it would be better to consult with those well versed in diplomatic matters. You haven't any clue about what your friends would say? Ludmilla paused to consider the question for a moment, realizing that each of their answers would be drastically different. Corlin and Gonye would say yes, she said. Wagner would say no. How they would go about saying yes or no is what I haven't a clue about, Your Majesty. Corlin would probably deliver the proclamation in such a way that all would be assured that it is to their benefit, then use the political goodwill that we garner as a foundation to build future endeavors upon. Wagner would exploit the thousands of opportunities that arise from how we structure our silence, which would in turn lay a different sort of foundation. Both of their approaches would aim to achieve the goals set for by our foreign policy. The intricacies of either are beyond me, it would be for Your Majesty's court to deliberate over. The Sorcerer King nodded. I believe that would be for the best. Either way, the Sorceress Kingdom will be extending its control over the Katsa Plains. We should focus on what we have to do here, yes? From attending Lady Sheltier's river date as a lady-in-waiting to adventurous exploration. Now she served as a captain spearheading their conquest. Her impromptu trip had certainly escalated. Ines and Sheltier took their usual places as their exploration recommenced, flying slightly behind Baroness Zaradnik's advance. She and her undead company marched their way northeast out of the plaza where the Royal Army's operations were being staged, following the remains of the city streets towards the massive tower located by Cocytus' reconnaissance forces. After several blocks, their procession slowed to a halt. He drifted over to the front, following the Baroness' curious gaze. A pair of elder liches were conferring over a clipboard as several arachnoid figures carefully picked their way through the ruins. Ah, those are 8-edge assassins, Zaradnik Dono, Ines told her. We can't afford the months it would take to pore over every piece of rubble in this city, so I had the Royal Army arrange for something instead. While they are fundamentally combat-oriented rogues, their detection skills are more than adequate for performing this sort of work. They're extremely powerful, the Baroness noted. I understand that they're not undead servitors, but can they be hired for domestic security? When it comes to the forces made available for the territories, we have a markedly weak reconnaissance relative to everything else. You noticed that as well? Multiple departments have pointed out our shortage in this area. The Royal Army needs scouts, Foreign Affairs needs intelligence agents and Domestic Affairs needs investigators and counterintelligence agents. Transportation needs. Did you ask for them as well, Sheltier? Sheltier turned from her watchful vigil to address him. No, Iron Summer. The Frost Dragons are excellent hunters, which happens to make them far superior at these tasks than most of the locals, aren't you? As it is, we're ahead of the other departments. If anything further is required, I'm sure Ludmilla will come up with something. She will? You've something planned along these lines, Zaradnik Dono? Not specifically for the Ministry of Transportation, Your Majesty, the Baroness replied, but the military installation in Warden's Vale will be a place for training soldiers. Amongst them will be a Ranger Corps that will provide support for other elements of the Royal Army. It's highly unlikely that they'll be anywhere near as effective as these 8-edge assassins, but they will be more than sufficient for regular duties. Why aren't the NPCs doing that? Is it because their standards are impossible for locally sourced agents to meet? No. Demiurge and Albedo are probably already doing something about the problem. I probably skimmed over the relevant report and forgot. Demiurge had requested permission to deploy several doppelgangers for his work in the Holy Kingdom, but that still employed Nazaric's resources. They needed to rely less on limited Yggdrasil-sourced means and shift their burdens to what could be sustained locally. Every Yggdrasil gold coin saved was one that went towards defending against the high-level threats that must surely be in the world somewhere. I appreciate your initiative, Zaradnik Dono, he told her. It's good to see citizens investing themselves in the affairs of the nation. Speaking of which, how is your recruiting done? Are you only training humans, or are demi-humans also involved? I am most familiar with humans and the training of human rangers, she replied. The development of my domain was originally structured to provide the appropriate growth rates of every profession required in my territory, including militant ones. Since then, however, a few demi-human species have moved in and each holds certain advantages over humans. Lizardmen, for instance, are superior when operating in marshy or semi-aquatic environments. Some races naturally lend towards being rangers. Also, with the demand for scouts in the Royal Army, I'll need to expand my efforts at recruitment once construction of the military facilities in my capital is complete. Ines nodded in satisfaction at her reply. The multiracial nature of our nation provides us with strengths that cannot be found in those primarily composed of one race. You've done well to recognize this, especially considering that the vast majority of local humans adhere to human-centric thinking. It is my hope that the people of our land eventually shift towards a collaborative mindset that is more suited to citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The Baroness fell strangely still at his words, staring up at him for some reason. A handful of seconds passed before she blushed and turned her gaze away. Is this truly your Majesty's will? Is it truly so strange to desire this? It's just that. Her voice trailed off, then she seemed to give herself a shake. No, of course not, Your Majesty. If it is your desire, then I shall see it done to the utmost of my ability. We nobles will follow your lead, though time will be needed to accustom ourselves to the new ways. What am I saying? Your Majesty must already know this, considering the nature of your rule thus far. The young noblewoman started to fidget nervously, and Ines grew curious over her reaction. Was what he had asked really that drastic of a change? Parts of her aristocratic mask had cracked, revealing the expression of one who had some pillar of their reality suddenly knocked out from under them. At some point, the Baroness became aware of his gaze. She wheeled her mount away and led her undead company forward again. They traveled a half-kilometer through the city streets before coming to the edge of another plaza. It was far larger than the one they had left, its distant ends obscured by the clinging mists. Baroness Zaradnik raised her left hand to an ear, nodding silently several times. She lowered her hand again. Orders from the Grand Marshal, she said. I'm to subjugate the main city plaza and use it as a battlefield to clear the undead between here and our destination. Then I suppose your task is clear, he replied. Also. He said something strange at the end. What was it? A scowl filled the noblewoman's expression and her voice dropped an octave. Show them the power of Naz-Ur, the Sorcerer's Kingdom. She grated, then her expression and tone returned to normal. Since these undead are mindless, they'd have no more or less appreciation over any particular method that I use. Furthermore, my company is not composed of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's regular forces. I'd be showing them the power of their fellow wild undead from the same area. It was a good thing Cocytus wasn't present to hear her. Ines could imagine the floor guardian's ardor deflating as the Baroness shredded his enthusiasm to bits. It's a common turn of phrase for us. His mind worked to provide an explanation. You're correct that, in our case, a show of strength will have no effect on the mindless undead. In this exercise, it should be taken in the sense that Cocytus wishes to see what you're capable of. An expression with different meanings, yes? I see, she replied. Thank you for the explanation, Your Majesty. As an aside, is this the reason you address me as you do? After fumbling out his response, Ines's already strained mind ground to a halt. What was she talking about? What do you hear, Zaradnik Dono? That is, you may address me in whatever form you wish, Your Majesty, but I'd just like to note that it's rather odd. Maybe this isn't the right way to put it, but it's as if you're addressing me as a commoner. Since you mentioned that your language incorporates terms and phrases with different meanings, it may be the reason why I hear that. You're referring to the way languages are translated, yes? In that case, you would be correct. I am using an honorific in my language that may be applied to different ranks in the regular social hierarchy. Ines frowned internally. Since he knew next to nothing of the various forms of etiquette practiced in the region, he thought he would be safe to use Dono. It seemed that it wasn't enough, however, and he had been snagged by someone with true expertise in how the world's auto-translate function worked. Then, Zaradnik Dono? Much better, Your Majesty, the Baroness smiled. When it comes to the use of linguistic elements like this, One must ensure that the appropriate concept is conveyed or the receiving party may hear the wrong thing. A non-existent, nervous sweat broke out over Ains's brow. How many thousands of donos had he used up to this point? It could mean Miss/Mrs/Mr. when addressing those without position or title, Master/Mistress for the leaders of guilds, businesses and other organizations, or Lord/Lady when speaking with members of the nobility or royalty. It was for this reason that he thought it was convenient and safe to use, but what had he really sounded like? Ains used Donner for Einsack because it was correct to call the guildmaster Master Einsack. He used it for Emperor Jerkniv because he was addressing a fellow sovereign. Since he had been trying to get on friendly terms with him, had he been calling him Mr. Jerkniv all along? "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer Zaradnik Donner?" he asked carefully. "I sense that you mean to put me at ease," the Baroness answered. "But to members of the region's nobility, being addressed in relation to one's title is our casual. We tend to only address one another by our first names in private and only if we're close to one another. No one is addressed in the style that your Majesty has been employing. Since you are our sovereign, especially paranoid nobles may take it as a threat or indication that they are being stripped of their titles. Since you put it that way, I suppose I should be careful of local nuances in language. You have my thanks, Zaradnik Dono." The Baroness lowered her head. "It is an honor to be of service, Your Majesty." "Ludmilla," Shiltir asked. "Have I been saying anything strange like that?" "No, my lady," Baroness Zaradnik answered. "From our first meeting, your speech and mannerisms have been appropriate to your station and our circumstances. Through your impeccable demeanor, others are always assured of where they stand." "Oh. Well, that's good then." Baroness Zaradnik left them to prepare for the upcoming battle. Ains watched her move about with an awkward, itchy feeling. Should I tell her that Shiltir speaks like a high-class courtesan and not a high-class lady? It appeared that the Baroness knew no equivalent for Shiltir's Yoshawara dialect. Or it could be that it had been attributed to institutions like the Imperial Harem, a place where only women of the highest caliber qualified to serve. Despite being called out on a catastrophic error that had potentially led to many misunderstandings in the past, Ains felt a sense of happiness wash over him. The number of individuals who would confront him on his mistakes or offer contradictory views was few and far between. That number tended to dwindle as time passed and people somehow convinced themselves that he was an untouchable genius, an endless font of unfathomable wisdom, or some sort of divine being. Or all of the above. Baroness Zaradnik came off as a young woman with a cool and distant aura, one that was extraordinarily adept at wearing the impenetrable mask of a noble. Yet, as he came to better know her, the genuine way in which she conducted herself made it seem like the mask was only there because she thought it should be, that she was the mask itself. It was the exact opposite of Ains, who hid behind the mask of what everyone thought that he was. Whether it was a mask or not, it appeared that what she considered service was not the unthinking acceptance of assigned tasks by the NPCs or so many of his acquaintances that slowly drifted into that state. He had hopes that she would continue to point out his mistakes, offer contradictory opinions if she felt it was necessary, and continue to act independently. The best part about it was that she appeared to be conscientious and discreet. Service was duty, and duty was held above all else. It felt a paradox that one who possessed what would be considered an arbitrary mindset could be trusted to not be arbitrary. Ains settled in for a long battle as the Baroness personally scouted the surroundings. Like most of the city, low-level undead were the vast majority of what could be seen. Though this was the case, the plaza was still large enough that the sprinkling of skeleton warriors, blood-meat hulks and other higher-level undead numbered in the hundreds. 10 minutes later, the bone vultures in the undead company started to fly off into the mist. Ains furrowed his non-existent brow as they vanished from view. As dominated undead, thus effectively his pets, he had a sense of where they were going. Each bone vulture became part of a grid that lay over the entire plaza, and the low rumble of thousands of undead filled the air. Baroness Zaradnik returned on her mount at a trot, motioning for her company to advance as she wheeled around before them. The company reorganized itself, blood-meat hulks forming the front rank while the skeleton warriors followed from behind. One of the death priests bringing up the rear held aloft the banner of the Sorceress Kingdom. The rumble of the undead grew as they advanced, and soon Ains saw what they were heading towards. He double-checked the locations of the other bone vultures, then nodded to himself. She aggroed the entire plaza in advance with the bone vultures, partitioning everything here into groups of a few hundred. Not something she can do with the living, or can she? Her tactical acumen was so far ahead when it came to what could be accomplished in this world that Ainz could only sit back and watch what she came up with. The scariest part was that most of her moves were easily understandable once they happened, even to Ainz. She used tactics composed of a few simple elements, which made them easy to carry out and extremely difficult to foil. In Yggdrasil, players who came up with stupidly convoluted ploys were generally the easiest to defeat. Simple, yet effective was the paradigm. As the blood meat hulks continued picking up momentum, Ainz could already envision the result. The charge playing out before him was undeniably simple, and at the end of it lay irresistible violence. By the time the Baroness Company made contact with the first group of undead, the massive blood meat hulks were moving forward at the speed of a galloping horse. The enemy had no skills, no martial arts, no spells or abilities to stop them. They didn't even make any sounds that could be distinguished from where Ainz and Shiltir were observing from above. One moment, hundreds of undead were trying to reach the bone vulture above them, the next, they were crushed. Everything under level 10 was pulverized. Everything that survived lay crippled and broken in the charge's wake. The skeleton warriors following from behind finished off the survivors and ran to catch up. The blood meat hulks had barely slowed as the Baroness led them towards their next target. Any damage taken was regenerated along the way. The next group of undead had a blood meat hulk. Baroness Zaradnik pulled further ahead of her ranks, punching through the group to reach the giant undead. Her glaive flashed out as she passed by, its silvery blade severing one leg, then another. The blood meat hulk toppled onto a dozen of its fellows. Those that turned to chase after the Baroness were trampled from behind. As with the first group, the company's skeleton warriors arrived to finish off the survivors while Baroness Zaradnik and her makeshift knights charged towards their next set of victims. Ainz shook his head as thousands of undead were crushed in mere minutes by a tiny fraction of their number. "Is it just me," Ainz muttered, "or does she get exponentially more violent with every large battle?" "She does." Shiltir's eyes glowed brightly as she slowly licked her lips, "and I love it."